Welcome to Houston Oasis. My name's Ted Andrews, and I'll be the MC for today. Traditionally, we open the meetings by contemplating one of our 5 core values that you see on the sign back here. Today, I'd like to consider be accepting and be accepted. For people who believe in a religion that tells them there is only one way, it can be difficult for them to be accepting. And that's one of the advantages of a secular community like Houston Oasis. We're not bound by a religious text or dogma, and we can accept people based on who they are rather than on what we believe. And Houston Oasis is very accepting of people regardless of their sexual orientation, their race, their culture. And frankly, that's the reason I think that Houston Oasis is such a nice place to be. Now, the other part of this core value is be accepted, and that puzzled me a little bit. I didn't quite know, because being accepted isn't really something that we do. And I think it really is because that if you're a member of an accepting group like Houston Oasis, as long as you follow the golden rule, you will be accepted. I'd like to thank the volunteers that make our Sundays possible here, starting with Abhishek, who is the guy who does our live streaming and Zooming, and he's also our events coordinator. And on the sound system, we have Kevin Comerford, and somewhere our coffee man is CB. Thank you, CB. Oh yeah, there he is. And we have back on the Houston Oasis donations, we have Alexis, who is also our Houston Oasis president. And I'd like to give her special thanks because that's pretty much somewhat of an unsung position, and she does a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes. So I'd just like to mention a few of the events that we have going on in the week coming up. First, on Tuesday, we have a very special event. Mike Nelson is hosting a free house concert at his house at 7:30. He's got 2 violinists from the Shepherd School of Music, 2 graduate students coming, and if you want to come, then you'll get with Mike or look in the Sunday Bulletin and see how to RSVP. He does have a limited number of positions there, but that'll be fun. Then on Wednesday, we have another Houston Oasis book club meeting where we'll finish up the Forget the Alamo book that we're reading, which, as the title, is a little bit jarring, and it is a very interesting book. See the other side of what might have really happened at the Alamo. And then on Thursday, we have one of our new Houston Oasis groups, the card-playing group that goes by the name of Houston Cards. We'll be getting together at Jennifer's house, and they have 3 tables of 4 people per table, so there's a limited number there. You'll have to RSVP for that as well. They have a lot of bridge enthusiasts there, but they are also open to hearts and spades and other more less intimidating card games, which is my preference, actually. And so I think that's about it. I will mention that we are still doing bike rides on Saturdays, but we're not really announcing them in the Sunday Bulletin. It's hot. We're getting started at 8 in the morning. And up until now, it's been actually quite comfy. There's been a breeze going, and we've got some interesting routes going into East Houston, into the 2nd Ward, and it's pretty cool. We've got a great lineup today. Our musical guest is Jimmy Smith. He's no stranger to Houston Oasis. He's a jazz guitarist. He's been here quite a few times in the past. And we also have a interesting main speaker, a professor of sociology from University of Tampa. And his topic is religion and happiness, much ado about nothing. And I know that that's a topic that most Oasians will find interesting.
Thank you for having me. I do apologize for not being there in person, but yesterday was my son's birthday party, and that took priority. So I do apologize for that, but and I think yeah, I'm delighted to be able to present, but I'm sorry I'm not there in person to get to know all of you a little bit better. Anyway, so what I'm presenting about today is a recently published book chapter. So this is a piece of work that I did with a colleague, David Speed, who's a psychologist in Canada. And I'm going to give some background on this before we get into kind of some of the details. But I'm really excited about this. So let me jump in and we'll talk about this. I'll give some background on the chapter. So first up, and obviously you don't have to say anything. It is a Zoom call, so it's a Zoom meeting. So it's a little awkward to get feedback, but I'm wondering how many of you have seen news articles like this. This came from The Independent that said religious people are happier, study finds. And that was back in 2019. Similar study that was reported in the newspaper that came back, religious people are happier than atheists, study finds. Similar time frame, February 13th, 2019. These pop up regularly in the news. I've seen them for years. I mean, I've been at this for quite a while now. And every time I see these, I just kind of, I get a little upset. I get a little angry because they're misrepresenting what's actually going on. And so what this book chapter does and what my presentation does today is basically wrestles with some of these things and then is going to present some data. I'm a data guy. I like numbers, calling into question all of these findings and basically showing that they're not true, but we'll get to that. So a little bit more background here just to kind of explain why I was interested in this and why I eventually decided to write this book chapter. I read a lot of scientific literature in my area, of course, and not surprisingly, the literature on the relationship between religiosity and happiness is really interesting because you keep finding things like this. Some studies will find a significant positive relationship between religiosity and happiness. Some studies will find a significant negative relationship between religiosity and happiness. And some studies find no relationship between religiosity and happiness. So if you've got some finding small positive relationships, small negative relationships, and many with no relationship, what does that lead you to think is the actual relationship between religiosity and happiness? And in my mind, the answer is actually pretty obvious that there's actually no meaningful relationship because the way that statistics works, I teach statistics, I'm a big fan of statistics. If we're finding really small relationships that go either side of no relationship, the best implication there, the kind of easiest implication is that there's no relationship. But there are lots of people who keep trying to suggest that there is in fact a meaningful positive relationship between religiosity and happiness. And there are major problems with those claims. I'm going to go through 5 of those problems briefly before I get into my study and show what we actually did. I'm not going to take too much time on this, but I think it's important just to give a little bit more of the background. So what are those problems? And I'm just going to mention them and I'll go over them in detail. Many of these studies focus only on the US. They don't use representative samples. They don't report effect sizes, which I'm going to explain. We're going to get a little technical here, but I think it's useful to understand. Very little of this research actually is causal, and causality is super important when we're dealing with things like this. And then finally, there's no theoretical reason why there should be a relationship, and that's often completely neglected in this body of scholarship. Okay, so let's tackle these quickly one at a time. What's the problem with focusing only on the US? Well, of course, the US, yeah, we have 330-ish million people in the US. It's a big population, but in no plausible way could we say that the US is representative of the world. Among developed nations around the world, the US is disproportionately religious. And of course, I had to throw a picture in here of former president holding a Bible upside down in order to get a good kind of shoot for his base, which I think was really interesting. But the US does still remain, we're not radically religious in the US, but we are disproportionately religious compared to other developed countries. Another characteristic of the US that does make us stand out is that we are hyper individualistic in the US. So the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand really stand out as being very individualistic, and that has some implications for the relationship between religiosity and happiness. So just studying this relationship in the US is actually very problematic. We are not representative of the mass majority of the world. So suggesting that we find a relationship here that applies elsewhere is really problematic, as we'll see. Another real serious problem with many of these studies is that they do not use what we call representative samples. So a representative sample is one where everybody in a target population has the same opportunity of being included in the sample. And you'll often hear that when we're doing like polling stuff, that it's a representative sample of the US. And you can do that with relatively small sample sizes, but it's got to actually be representative. What you find instead with many of these studies is something like this, right? That they'll get a sample of older Black women in rural Alabama, and they'll find that those women who are slightly more religious are slightly happier than those who are not religious. And then they kind of assume that there's a meaningful relationship between religiosity and happiness. You know, I do this for my job. This is, I mean, I teach statistics. I'm very into this. A sample of older Black women in rural Alabama is not representative, not only of Alabama or of women or of older Black women or of the US or of anything other than older Black women in rural Alabama. So we cannot then generalize that finding to the rest of the world population. But the vast majority of positive findings between religiosity and happiness look just like this. There are these obscure samples in different populations. One of them that I mentioned in the book chapter was older Chinese immigrants to the United States. Okay. Why they're looking at samples like that, it just is kind of mind-boggling to me, but this is not uncommon. So really what we need to do is look at representative studies or representative data to see what the relationship actually is. So we're going to come back to this because this is what we do. All right, now we're going to take a little bit of a technical side note here because I think this is important for people to understand. We need to, when we're looking at any kind of statistical relationship, not only do we need to determine if something is statistically significant, but we need to think about how meaningful that relationship is. And I'll explain this. So all statistical significance means is that some relationship between two variables or more variables is so unusual that we can rule out chance. Okay, that's all it really means. But I like to use kind of an analogy here to help people understand what this really means. And I'm going to use, not that I'm not encouraging anybody to do this, right? But it's just a useful one. I like to use the lottery, okay? So statistical significance is kind of like winning the lottery. The reason for that, right, is the odds that you'll win are actually kind of low. Same thing with finding a statistically significant relationship between two variables. But the fact that you won, that's great. That's the equivalent of like something being statistically significant. But just because you won doesn't mean you won a lot. How much you win, I think, is a much more important question than the fact that you won. So if you win $70 on a scratch-off ticket, technically you won the lottery, right? You won. Congratulations. But is that going to change anything? Is that going to make a difference, a meaningful difference in your life? And the answer, of course, is no, versus say winning, $750 million in a jumbo jackpot. I think that would actually change people's lives, right? So what we really have to look at is not whether somebody won the lottery, because it's pretty easy actually to find that something is statistically significant, but to find a meaningful relationship that's actually a big, powerful relationship, that's a world of difference. And so a lot of the studies that have found a statistically significant relationship between religiosity and happiness, they haven't actually found a meaningful relationship, just a statistically significant relationship. And that is actually a very important difference, because just because you found something that's statistically significant doesn't mean it matters at all. And so we're going to come back to that, because in our study, we actually do look at this in depth. And just as a note, effect sizes range from small, medium to large. Anything below small is actually considered negligible, which means there's nothing meaningful here. This is subclinical. It's completely worthless. You shouldn't even be thinking about it. And as we'll see, the negligible part actually matters a lot for this. Okay, you're all familiar with this. Correlation is not causation. I'm sure many of you have heard this phrase many times. But basically, when we think about causality in the social sciences in particular, we have to deal with three really basic rules, okay? The first one is that, A must precede B in time. So that makes sense. A must be related to B in some fashion. And then we have to rule out spuriosity or some other relationship, right? So A must be dependent upon B alone, but can't just be explained by C. It gets a little complicated. But basically, we've got three important pieces here. The gold standard research would be experimental. But that gets really hard when we're dealing with religiosity. You can't really assign some people to be religious and other people to not be religious and then look to see what that does to their happiness. That would be really cool, probably unethical, but really cool to do, but that doesn't exist. So the next best option that we have is longitudinal research, where we can measure people at time 1, and then we follow up again at time 2, and we see if there are any changes based on what they were like at time 1. It's not quite as good as experimental research, but it's pretty good. The problem is almost none of the research looking at religiosity and happiness is actually longitudinal. And I will admit ours is actually not longitudinal either, but this is a serious problem with the field. So I'm going to kind of just say that's a problem. We're not addressing it with our study, but something to note. And then the last one is the theory piece. So whenever we're working with these kinds of relationships, we want to, of course, make sure that there's a logical reason why we would expect there to be a relationship between whatever variables we're examining. So I always like to ask, why do we think there would be a relationship between religiosity and happiness? How would being religious improve somebody's happiness? And there are possible ways. So just having an affiliation, I think, makes no sense, right? It's just because somebody's a Catholic or they're a Mormon or they're a Jehovah's Witness. Just having that identity, I think, would not contribute at all to somebody's happiness. But attending an organization like Oasis, right? That might do it through socializing and social support. So we know that people who have healthy social relationships do tend to be happier. So there is a possibility that people who actually regularly are involved with religion might be a little bit happier. But the reason for that is not because they're involved with religion, it's because they're involved in a group. And that group does contribute to happiness. So it's social support. So that actually does make sense. The other possibility is maybe people's beliefs. So maybe religiosity helps them cope or makes them feel like somebody actually cares about them. Turns out, though, the research on coping is actually mixed. Some people don't cope very well. So when somebody close to them dies, they actually get angry at God and they feel like the world isn't just. So it gets really complicated. But the only possible kind of theoretical rationale that makes sense to me is really that there's a linkage between people who regularly attend and having a social support network. We don't actually control for this. We do in a different study, and we show that that actually does account for most of the differences in health that you find, which I'm happy to send people the link to that study as well if you're interested. Okay, so none of that, of course, is exclusive to religion. All of this you can get outside of religion, including through groups like Oasis, which I think is great. So I do think with just those 5 reasons, there's plenty of reason to be skeptical about the relationship between religiosity and happiness. And of course, this is what led me to wanting to write this book chapter. And then I was approached by the editor of the book. She approached me and said, we're writing this book about religiosity and happiness. So that was the general proposal with the book. And knowing that I've written extensively about the non-religious, they asked me to write a chapter on the non-religious. And really what they wanted was a chapter on how non-religious people conceptualize happiness. And I said, that's actually not the chapter I want to write. I want to write a different chapter. And because it's a book and I have a lot of leeway with book chapters, I don't know how many of you read journal articles, but they're very kind of pro forma. You have to do very specific things with journal articles. The nice thing about book chapters, you can kind of do different things in book chapters. And that opened up the opportunity for us to write this book chapter. So it's a little bit different. But basically, I told the editor, I said, hey, I've got an idea. I'm willing to write this book chapter, not the one that you actually asked me to do. And she gave me a green light. So I wrote it. I brought in a co-author, and I'm actually really excited about this because I think it's really cool. Okay. Now to our study. So that was a little bit of background. Let me give you our study, and we'll go through this pretty quickly. I'm trying to pay attention to time. So our data, we're using a survey that's called the World Value Survey. It goes in waves. These are not longitudinal waves. They're cross-sectional, so it's not the same people over time. But it started all the way back in the 1980s. We're using wave 6, which is data from 2010 to 2014. When we were first writing up this study, that was the latest wave that was out. There's a new wave that's now come out, wave 7. For our particular study, we're looking at 60 countries around the world. On a couple of these, there are variables that are missing. So it might be like 57 to 60 countries, but that's basically what we have. All right. So that's our source of data. And the nice thing about the World Value Survey, it's publicly available. So anybody who is wondering about our data, our analysis, they can replicate exactly what we did. That's what's nice about doing this scientifically. Here's our dependent variable. So this is a measure of happiness. And this is literally what the variable is taking all things together, would you say you are 1, not at all happy, all the way to 4, very happy. So that's the dependent variable. That's the variable we're trying to explain. And then we have 3 key independent variables that we use to try and do this. I'm going to go through those quickly as well. So our first one, independently of whether you attend religious services or not, would you say you are religious, not religious, or an atheist? You'll note there's an asterisk there. If you look down at the bottom, this may be one of the worst questions that's ever been asked because the atheist actually says convinced atheist. It's super problematic, but just so you're clear, I'm combining not religious and atheist because they're not mutually exclusive. That's why it's a terrible question. So we're really just looking at the difference between those who say I have a religious affiliation and I don't. That's really what that is. So that's our affiliation question. Then we have a belief question. How important is God in your life? This ranges from 1, not at all, to 10, very. And that's our belief question. And then our last one is our behavior question. We tend to think about religiosity as having multiple dimensions. So we've got belonging, which is our first one, belief is our second one, and behavior is our last one. And that's how often you attend religious services. So we're going to look at each of those independently and see if they actually predict how happy people are. Okay. So I hope everybody's got that. Really quick technical side note. We're looking at these relationships. So basically 3 different relationships in 60 different countries. That's a lot of analyses. And those who understand statistical significance will know that just by chance, we can actually be wrong about 1 time in 20 just by doing this. So we have, in fact, used a home Bonferroni correction. It's just a really technical side note for anybody who's really into statistics. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A. I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. All right, now to the results. And I will note right at the beginning, there is a link at the end of my presentation to the entire chapter. So anybody who's interested, you can download the chapter. It's available free on my website. I'm not supposed to do that, but it is. So if you have any really technical details, they're all explained there, but I'm happy to answer questions too. I'm not showing all of the big, long, complicated tables that are in the actual chapter. I figured out a way to simplify this just using charts that I think the chart should make sense as we present in this kind of format. So what I'm actually plotting is effect sizes. So the relationships as effect sizes. So you can see and keep in mind, effect sizes aren't indicating whether it's statistically significant. They're indicating how big the relationship is, which is more important. Okay, so let's get to it. So this is that first kind of relationship. Our dependent variable is happiness. The independent variable is their religious identity. Okay, so this is whether they say I'm religious or I'm not religious. And you'll see up here, I don't know if you can see my mouse. I put 6 countries in just because I needed more countries. These 3, there is not a statistically significant relationship, but I put them in just as kind of a comparison. Out of the 60 countries that we looked at, only 3 out of 60 had a statistically significant relationship. It's these 3 right here. But what I'm plotting for those who are really interested in the details on this left-hand side, this is effect sizes, okay? And I'm just gonna kind of define what these are with a little bit of additional information. So anything between 0.1 and 0.3 on this particular effect size is considered a small effect, okay? So that's small. A medium effect is anything from 0.3 to 0.5, and anything above 0.5 is actually a large effect size, okay? So out of the 60 countries that we looked at, 3 were statistically significant, and none of them even reached a small effect size. So what are we seeing when it comes to the relationship between religious identity? So this is somebody's religious affiliation and happiness. 3 countries, India, Turkey, and the United States, are statistically significant on this, but the effect is negligible, meaning it's meaningless. There is no meaningful effect between somebody saying, I have a religious affiliation and how happy they are, okay? That's what that first one shows us. We've got 2 more to do. We're gonna look at belief and behavior as well, okay? So hopefully this chart makes sense. Happy to answer any questions if people have them in the Q&A. So here's our next one. This is religious belief. And if you remember, this is the importance of God, and this is the relationship between that and happiness. Similar situation. I've got more down here. All of these countries, so I will say on this one, all of those countries, I think it's like 14 countries, did have what's considered a statistically significant relationship between their belief and happiness, okay? But keep in mind, just because they're significant doesn't mean it's meaningful. Now we have to look at effect sizes. And just like we did before, this is what we're dealing with, okay? Anything Above 0.025 all the way up to 0.15 is considered a small effect with this particular effect size. Medium effects would be from 0.15 to 0.35, and then anything above 0.35 is large effect. So looking carefully across this, we may have 14 out of our 60 or so countries with a statistically significant relationship. 2 of them, Malaysia and Rwanda, have a small effect size. But, and this is always fun, 2 of these countries actually had a negative relationship, okay? Which means, so out of the 14 countries, right, 2 had a small effect, and 1 of those, the relationship is actually the opposite. So the more important belief in God was for you, the less happy you were in Rwanda and Yemen, in those 2 countries, okay? So of the 14, 2 actually had the opposite. Do keep in mind, and I just want to note this, the US is still here, right? Statistically significant relationship, but negligible. So this is so small that it's meaningless. There's not a meaningful relationship between those 2 there. All right, so we have one more relationship to look at, I'm trying to be close on time here. And that's the relationship between attendance, right? So here's attendance. Similar situation, we have, again, 12 or so countries where there's a statistically significant relationship between religious attendance and happiness. Here are our effect sizes again, okay? So I'll just throw those in. And what do we see? For all of these countries where, yes, there's technically a statistically significant relationship, the effect size is so small as to be meaningless, with the exception of 1 country right there, the United States. Okay, and that country just barely crosses the line into a small effect size, meaning like there's something there, but it's certainly not a big effect. This is not even a medium effect. It's a very, very small effect. Okay, that's the data. Again, if you're really interested, I'll give you the link to the chapter at the end. You can go through and detail all of our analyses, because we detail them very carefully. But let's just quickly discuss this. So what do we find? In a small number of countries around the world where we have good representative data, we do find statistically significant relationships between religious belief, behavior, and belonging and happiness. So that is true, but the relationship for the most part is so small that it's meaningless. There is not a meaningful, sizable relationship between any dimension of religiosity and happiness in the vast majority of countries around the world. And 60 is not all of the countries, of course, the countries that we have data for. All right, so what is the takeaway implication? This relationship is subclinical. So if somebody were to say, like, I'm depressed, or I'm not as happy as I think I should be, which that's a whole different issue, and we could wrestle with what that means. If they went to a therapist, there is no justification for any therapist to ever recommend religion as a treatment for depression. It's just subclinical. There's nothing meaningful here, yet there are lots of studies that try and argue this, and we see it in the news all the time. People saying, oh, no, there's a meaningful relationship. If we remember all those problems, right, many studies use the US only. Well, it turns out the US is clearly an outlier. It is weird when it comes to the relationship between religiosity and happiness. That is a serious problem. If you're not using representative studies, you're going to find something very different from what we found. They don't report their effect sizes. Turns out effect sizes is the major thing to understand when it comes to the relationship between religiosity and happiness. If you don't do this, you're missing the entire relationship. We don't have a lot there when it comes to causal research, so that's a problem. And then, of course, they offer no theoretical rationale, which I think does help explain why so many of the studies that get published are so heavily flawed. They are majorly problematic studies. Being cognizant of time, I was told to go about 25 minutes, so let me wrap up here. What's our big conclusion? This is ultimately what we wrote in the chapter, right? So our chapter was supposed to be about non-religious people and their conceptions of happiness. At the very end, we say, we don't even need to deal with this because there's not a meaningful relationship between religiosity and happiness. So there's no reason to say, like, how are non-religious people happy? They're happy like everybody else because there's no difference. There's no reason to write about them as some separate group of people. They're just as happy or just as unhappy, however you want to think about it, as everybody else. There's no meaningful difference. If you do find someone claiming that there is a difference, hopefully, as a result of this relatively brief presentation, and of course, the chapter, you can immediately ask them, what's your source? What's the sample size? What's the effect size? Any of those questions. And of course, you are now welcome to send them my chapter. Anybody who wants that, if you scan the QR code, so you're welcome to do that. I'll leave this up for a minute or two, or type in that URL. So either one of those, I tried to make this as easy as possible. That'll take you directly to my professional website, which has the entire chapter embedded. You can download it. There's a link to download it. You can read through the chapter. You can send that to anybody you want. But basically that chapter does exactly what I just said, right? And I described. It goes through it in very intricate detail, lots of citations, all of the tables, it's all in there. But anyway, the big takeaway is that this is really much ado about nothing. There is no meaningful relationship between religiosity and happiness. And I'm happy to turn to questions now. I'm going to leave that up there for just a second longer in case anybody else wants to scan it, or if anybody wants to grab that URL. But then I'm happy to turn to questions and answer questions if that's possible using this Zoom approach.
All right, we'll start our questions off with Stephen.
Good morning and happy birthday to your son.
Thank you.
Actually, quick question. Has there been any studies in which maybe somebody who is struggling financially somehow finds him or herself attending a church in which everybody's on some sort of spiritual high, and that church is primarily affluent, and it seems like on the surface, you know, everybody has their stuff together as far as finances and life events, and has there been any studies about how that might contribute to that person's depression? And how old did your son turn?
My son is turning 13. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. That's an interesting question. Basically, what you're describing is a type of social comparison, right? That somebody joins a congregation or ends up going to a congregation and then feels inadequate because everybody else seems to be doing fairly well. I haven't seen a study that specifically looks at that question. There are a number of studies that look at negative religious coping, and I'd be happy to send you some of those if you wanted to message me through the chat or email me. There are a number of studies that talk about negative social coping, but negative religious social comparison, I have never seen that study, which, yeah, I mean, it sounds like a really interesting study. It would have to do something like that, you'd have to be very opportunistic, right? Like you'd have to be waiting for that particular opportunity to arrive, where somebody who's less affluent joins an affluent congregation and then feels that lack of social comparison, or the social comparison that just turns out negative for them. But I think it's an interesting question. Certainly there's plenty of research to suggest that when people engage in those kinds of social comparisons, it can have detrimental consequences, but not in the context of religion. I just haven't seen that. But again, interesting question. Thank you.
All right, we have a question from Mike.
Oh, hi. Okay, so you talked about the positive side. How about the negative side? Any thoughts on religion as related to anxiety, depression, and?
Yeah, again, good question. There is some research on this. Yeah, so a lot of this comes out of the psychological literature. And I am a sociologist. I dabble in both, right? So I am a little less familiar with it than maybe I should be. But I can reference two different types of findings that have come out of the literature here. So you're probably familiar with something like the Big Five personality inventories, which are the kind of validated personality inventories. One of the ones where religious people stand out from non-religious people. So non-religious people tend to be really open to new experiences. That's one of the areas where non-religious people kind of differ. But where religious people tend to be a little bit different is they tend to be more neurotic. And that has actually translated into, a finding that dovetails with that. So it's not so much depression, but it's neuroticism. A finding that dovetails with that is people can actually develop a type of OCD that is specific to religiosity called scrupulosity. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of scrupulosity, but this is basically people who religion gets so deep into their brains that they feel like they are always sinful They're never clean, never righteous, never doing what God wants them to do in whatever context, that it becomes a variant of OCD, of obsessive compulsive disorder. And this, of course, once you hit the actual diagnosis, this means this is life altering. This is causing problems in their everyday life. And that is actually something that comes out. It's certainly not widespread, but this is one of those very clear negative consequences that derives from religiosity. As far as, I'm sure there are very specific cases of people, finding religion and having problems, and it leads to depression. Certainly the whole sex abuse scandal that comes out of, different religions has contributed to that. But as far as finding clear evidence of like trends for specific groups of people where being religious leads them to be less happy, I haven't seen anything like that. So the findings that I have seen that are kind of leading people towards negative outcomes because of religion would be the neuroticism that can lead to scrupulosity. Again, there are some really interesting studies on that. If you're really interested, you can email me and I can send you a couple papers about scrupulosity. But I think it's fascinating that there's actually a subset of OCD that is specific to religious people that's got its own name, scrupulosity, which I think is pretty fascinating.
All right. Next question from Brandon.
Okay, so would you say then, based on your data, it kind of gave the impression that religious and atheist people have a similar level of happiness? Was that roughly about the same? Yeah, it's statistically insignificant difference.
Right.
And would you say that points to the fact that the human brain's ability to cope is very strong with whatever worldview, even if it doesn't account to the real reality of the world?
Yeah. I think you're right on, right, in your interpretation. Just to add a little bit to that, we actually see higher rates of suicide in more developed countries than we see in less developed countries. Which gets to the point that you were making, right? That the human brain is really good at adapting. So even people who are living in less affluent societies, they can adapt to their environment, and they actually tend to be slightly happier, which is kind of interesting. Where we see substantial shifts in people's happiness is actually when they get shocked. So there are external forces that shock them. Some of you may have heard this, and not that I meant to do this with my example, but winners of lotteries, right? So win really big sums, they're actually more likely to commit suicide. That shift, right, the change in their life can actually have really detrimental consequences on their mental health. And we know that with like divorces and deaths in the family, things like that, that all of those are like external shocks that cause problems. But the human brain is really good at adapting to whatever environment you're in. And so whether you're religious or not doesn't seem to have any meaningful bearing on how happy you are. There are lots of other things that can contribute to that, but religiosity is just not a meaningful contributor.
Next question from Jacob.
Yes, so data was from 2019. Since the pandemic, has there been any sort of restructuring of data collection methodologies as far as you're aware?
Yes, I don't know on World Value Survey, but the other big survey that we use in the US, and it's kind of considered the gold standard of survey data collection, is the General Social Survey. It's run basically every other year. So there was a 2018 one, there was supposed to be a 2020 wave of the General Social Survey. The General Social Survey is run by the National Opinion Research Center, which is associated with the University of Chicago. Okay, so it's technically not the University of Chicago, but it's associated with them. And it's funded by the National Science Foundation. So this is a long-running survey. It's done basically every 2 years, started in 1972. They did do data collection in 2020. It bled into 2021. But they shifted the modality. The reason why it was considered the gold standard is because the interviews were always done in person. They would literally send out a horde of survey researchers, right? And they would go, that using a probability sampling frame gets complicated, but they would go door to door and collect, excuse me, and they would do the surveys door to door in person, sensitive questions. They would hand them like a tablet or a piece of paper back when they used to do that. So if anything that was sensitive about their sexual, encounters or something, they didn't have to actually respond to the person. But they also paid people like $500 to take a 2-hour survey, which is pretty enticing for most people. That all, of course, fell apart during the pandemic. So the group that does this, National Opinion Research Center, they switched to an online modality during the pandemic. And the response rate was over 60%. It had consistently been like 60 to 80% response rates before the pandemic. As a result of the pandemic, the response rate plummeted. So they did go to an online, mostly online modality. And now they're talking about staying there, which many of us who use that survey are really kind of disturbed by, because it was the gold standard with really high response rates. Excuse me. Another comparable survey, but well-known survey group in the US, Pew, until they set up their own panels, which is how a lot of surveys are done now, their response rates had fallen to below 10%. And response rates are really important when we think about survey research, because if you have really low response rates, then you could very much have response bias. Certain groups of people could just be choosing not to answer these questions. And then we have to weight things afterwards, right? So we get into complicated weighting stuff. I don't know if the World Value Survey changed their modality. I should look into that. I wasn't using data since the pandemic for this, but I do know with some of the other big companies and big outfits that do these big national or international surveys, they have had to change their modalities as a result of the pandemic. And the numbers have shifted a fair amount. I literally read a report 2 weeks ago about some of the religiosity data in the latest wave of the General Social Survey, and their change in modality shifted that pretty substantially. So there are some problems as a result of changing that modality. That's a really interesting, very technical question. I could talk about it at length, but thanks for the question.
All right, next question.
Hi, I know your focus is Mormonism, and I'm curious as to if you were raised in it or what pulled you in that direction.
Yeah, I'm originally from Utah. I was raised in the LDS Church. I'm one of 9 kids, good solid Mormon stock. On my father's side, they were actually some of the pioneers who came across in the mid 1800s. Yeah. My mom's side, they're converts, and my parents met at BYU. Like I said, I'm one of 9 kids. My sister is 7 of 9, which is awesome. It's a good Star Trek reference for anybody out there. I'm 6 of 9. I left the church over 20 years ago. So when I went to graduate school, basically that was it. But I did serve a mission. I served a mission in Costa Rica, picked up Spanish, and just have retained an interest in that. But I would say probably 60, maybe 70% of my research these days is on the non-religious, on atheists, agnostics, humanists, et cetera, and secularization, so the decline of religiosity around the world. And I still do 30 to 40% of my research on the LDS Church, Mormons, Mormonism, stuff like that. But I've been out for over 20 years now. Yeah, going on 21 years. And a sister of mine actually just left as well. But I was not instrumental in that. I've been very kind of just hands off, let them do whatever they want to do. But one of my sisters also just left the church. I hope that answers that. I'm happy to talk more about that if people are interested.
It's sounding like we need to have you back for another talk later.
We can do that.
Our last question is from Noe.
You know, I'm talking to very religious people. I'm surprised at how almost fantastical their conversion seems. It's like, I've heard evangelists say, I was on top of a mountain and the oak skies opened up and then they became religious. I'm wondering if there's any correlation between fantastical thinking, psychotic thinking, and extreme religiosity.
Yeah, that is a good question. Yeah, so one study that comes to mind is from a friend. His name's Darren Sherkat. He's at the University of Illinois Carbondale. And I'm trying to remember when that study was done, if he published it or if he just presented it at a conference. It might have just been a conference presentation. He never published it, but he did draw a correlation. And I don't think, I think we have to be careful here. We're really talking about the margins. Okay. So the vast majority of people who are religious because they were raised religion. religious. So it's purely parental socialization. There is no better correlation or better predictor of somebody's religiosity as a youth than their parents' religiosity. So for the vast majority of people, they're not having that, Paul type conversion, right, where he's on the road to Damascus or whatever. They're not having these big visions, things like that. That's for a relatively small kind of marginal percentage of people. But that particular study that Darren Sherkat was reporting on, and I don't remember, I'd have to look in my archives. He was making the point that for many famous religious individuals, it's just kind of interesting to say, right? Paul is a good example of this, but for many famous religious individuals, their conversion experiences are not meaningfully removed from what we would describe as schizophrenia or delusions, people hearing voices, right? That basically what we're describing with these, really impressive kind of experiences, right? The visions and things like that are really not that far removed from mental health disorders. That said, again, I think these are marginal experiences, right? That's not true for the vast majority of people. The vast majority of religious people, they were just raised religious. This is what they're going to do. In one of my earlier books, I reported that 60% of religious people never question their religion. And I don't think most of us realize that, right? That for the vast majority of religious people, this is just what you do. It's like talking, it's like breathing. They were just raised with it and they're never going to question it. And it's just not a big deal for them. It's only about 40%, and that was older data, about 10 years ago, but about 40% do question their religion. So dealing with those margins, I think that's fair to say, right? So you get your like Joan of Arcs and your Pauls. What's to say that these individuals didn't have schizophrenia? I mean, that's absolutely like a valid question that could be raised as to whether that's what's actually going on, or maybe they were, delusional, maybe they were dehydrated. Some of you may be familiar with Michael Shermer. I don't necessarily mean to bring up the controversy surrounding him, but Michael Shermer did write about, he used to be one of those like long distance bike racers where they would race across the country and they wouldn't sleep for hours and hours, like days at a time. And doing that can lead to delusions. He literally would see visions of like aliens coming down and trying to abduct him while he's racing along on his bike. And he's the founder of Skeptic Magazine. So it can happen to basically anybody given, very specific circumstances. That doesn't mean that Joan of Arc was schizophrenic or Paul, had delusions or something like that. But, there was a reason why, Native Americans were using certain chemicals to alter their brain because that's actually a very effective approach at doing this. The same is true with LSD. So the studies that have been done really in the 1950s, before it became illegal to do it, using LSD, they would actually, I don't know if you've read some of these, some of them are really fascinating. They would bring students into different environments and they'd actually administer LSD over a weekend and then see what happened. And if they put them in a church, they all reported having the most religious experiences of their entire lives. If they put them in a different context, they would have amazing experiences, but not religious at all. So certainly there's something to be said for that it's very possible that there's, this relationship going on. But again, I think we're dealing with the margins, not the vast majority of people.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cragun. That's a fascinating topic, and I think it's a very important one, very important work that you're doing there. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
First, I'd just like to say that there's three main ingredients that allow Houston Oasis to operate. One is your presence here on Sundays. The other is the volunteers that help make it happen. And of course, the other one is money. And you may not know that it costs us $400 every Sunday to rent this facility. And besides that, of course, we pay our musicians and we pay speaker costs, etc. And basically, since the time we've restarted after the pandemic or during the pandemic, whatever we're in now, we have been running a deficit. So if you have something that you can donate, that's much appreciated. If you don't, then that's also understood. But we have Alexis in the back there. She's taking donations. And if you prefer to just look at it on your own, on the back of the Sunday bulletin, there's information on how to donate.